Boys and girls, today I want to talk about a cheap but legendary guitar amp. I want to talk about the Marshall Valvestate from the 90s. A lot of iconic bands used the Valvestate on their records. In Flames, Prong, Static X, Death, and many others. That's one thing. On the other hand, it has always been like Marshall's ugly son, you know. It's a transistor amp with one preamp tube. So, you know, that used to be the amp for people who could not afford a real Marshall amp, a JZM 800 or JZM 900. And one of those guys who could not afford a real tube amp back in the 90s was me. So my first real amp used to be the 112 Valvestate Combo, and I loved it back then. I later added a speaker output so I could drive a 4x12 as well. And yeah, that was my first real amp, and it sounded really brutal, and I really loved it back then, until I made the next step into the tube world. But lately, it seems, there's a certain Valvestate revival. People, you know, are becoming nostalgic about this amp. A lot of people are buying them used. And today I want to find out how that thing actually sounds and how cool it is. I want to show you which tones you can get with it and what makes it special. I want to see how it compares to a real tube amp. And I also want to play the preamp of the Valvestate into a tube power amp. That means we will have a lot of fun today. Let's get started. Let me show you today's rig. As usual, I'm playing my Fernandez Ravel baritone guitar loaded with EMGs. And we're playing all the amps into the same setup. We're using a Mesa Boogie 4x12 cabinet, and there's only one speaker mic'd, and this is an Eminence DV77 mic'd with a single SM57. You know, I'm in love with that speaker, and it's so sad that it's so hard to get the DV77. Still, I think you can't get it at all in Europe. So for those people who cannot get a DV77 right now, check out my official Eminence DV77 IR pack. It's in the description. You get some great tones. So, Fernandez guitar with EMGs into all the amps, and finally into a Mesa Boogie cab with an Eminence DV77 mic'd with a single 57. Here we go. One thing that I forgot to mention, we're boosting all amps in this video with a tube screamer. There's no gain coming from the tube screamer, but slightly we're pushing the amp a little bit here. The reason is a tube screamer, as you might know, makes the bass tighter and adds attack. But another reason is that the Valvestate amp doesn't have that much gain actually. So I like pushing it a little more to just sound more high gain. Before we play the Valvestate, let me show you my reference, and that is the Brunetti Extra Lead. So first we're gonna hear a tube amp, and then we're gonna see how the Valvestate compares. So this is what the Brunetti sounds like. What a great tone. This is a very harmonically complex distortion. This is a typical tube distortion, and it's a, let's call it full sounding, very full sounding, but also forward sounding frequency response, just great for anything metal. The distortion is complex and sophisticated sounding. Beautiful overtones. Nice sound. So now let's switch to the Valvestate. Remember, everything else in the signal chain stays the same. Well, and this really sounds like a transistor amp cliche, don't you think? That scoop mid-range, that aggressive top end, and also that kind of two-dimensional sounding distortion, overall slightly harsh, and like what's missing is a real voice in the mids. You know, there seem to be a lot of noisy parts of the guitar tone, but not the actual voice. And that is the transistor cliche. Let's go back to the Brunetti. Huge difference, right? Huge difference. I mean, that amp has a voice. It has those thick lower mids. Really, really beautiful. And the valve state. Sounds aggressive. The distortion is tight. That is a good thing. But again, it sounds quite two-dimensional. And it has a kind of weird frequency range. Very 90s sounding frequency range. Scooped with aggressive upper mids and a lot of fizzle, sizzle, how do you call this, in the highs. But I've got some good news for you. Right now, all the knobs on the Valvestate are at noon. And this amp, the good thing about this amp, it is highly tweakable. One thing that makes it really special is that contour knob, which consists of several filters. So this is very, very powerful to change the overall frequency range. You cannot change the distortion, but you can change the frequency range dramatically. So that's what I'm going to do. First thing I want to try is I want to get this amp to sound closer to the tube amp. How beautiful, how full can I make this amp sound? Let's go. First thing I want to do, I want to crank the mids, because as you've just heard it, it sounds very scooped, which is a 90s thing, I know, but I need a lot more mids. So let's crank them. Let's try to add a little more bass. Not a lot happening, but a little better again. Now let's try to reduce the highs a little. Better. I really want to get rid of that shh. Now let's talk about that contour knob, because what it is doing, as far as I know, is if you turn it from noon counterclockwise, it acts like a low-pass filter, which means it will cut the highs and make the sound darker, which is something that could be useful right now. So let's try that. A very effective filter. That's too much, of course, but let's cut some of the highs. So now the frequency range sounds a lot fuller and less brittle than before. The distortion still sounds a little flat, if you ask. Let's go back to the Brunetti. It can even get darker. Oh, but this is much better already. Yeah, so what you want to do if you want to get a more complex and more beautiful tone out of the Valvestate is get rid of those nasty highs by using the treble knob, but also the contour knob. If you turn it counterclockwise, things are getting darker, and it just sounds a little more beautiful, a little more full, because the whole tone is not dominated by the This is a pretty usable tone already. Nice. Sometimes it makes sense to tweak an amp. Okay, now on to the next level. What happens if we play only the preamp of the valve state, but into the power amp of a tube amp. And remember, what we want is a beautiful and full sound. So we should use an amp that gives us a lot of full sounding mids. And my favorite for a tone like this would be the Diesel D-moll. You've seen it a few times in my videos. So I've already connected the valve state to the Diesel. I just need to switch 2 cables and then we're ready to switch between all valve state and valve state with the Diesel power amp. Interesting comparison. Let's go. So this is the valve state alone. I still hear quite some and the note separation is not the best. So the noisy parts of the guitar tone are still very present. Let's switch to the Diesel power amp. Oh, and that really rounds off the sound. And adds some tube complexity. Back to the valve state. So once you switch to the Diesel, you know, all the is gone, the lower mids get thicker, and the overall distortion is just a little more beautiful, a little nicer, a little, yeah, more complex, a little, yeah, harmonically sweeter, is that a word? This still sounds a little flat and a little cheap. Diesel. Wah. That is a nice experiment, don't you think? So let me sum it up. No, the valve state doesn't sound as beautiful as a tube amp, not at all. But you can tweak it to get really close, and it gets even better once you use a great sounding, harmonically rich sounding tube power amp. Yeah, but if you have a head like this, you might ask a question, hey, why should I even use the Marshall? Because the Diesel also has actually 3 great sounding preamp channels. You are right, because most people don't use the valve state for tones like this, let's be honest. We use the valve state for those scooped 90s tones and not for something beautiful. And many people, me included, use it to mix it on productions with more mid-forward sounding guitar tones, which is something I will show you later in this video. So after this first experiment where we try to make this little valve state amp sound beautiful, we will now do the opposite. We will turn the contour knob to the other side, clockwise, because I think back in the 90s nobody had ever turned it counterclockwise from 12 o'clock on. No, but I never did that, at least. I think that every amp should have a contour filter built in. It's so powerful. From extremely scooped to kind of neutral but very aggressive sounding to very dark. And now let's try to get a tone that sounds more 90s, more brutal. I go back to 12 o'clock. Let's go. This is what happens when you turn the contour clockwise. So fucking 90s. From back in the days when it was cool, you know, a lot of distortion and no mids. Yeah, but that's a little too extreme. Contour at 2 o'clock brings back some mids, but you know, it stays scooped and brutal. Cranking the mids is never a bad idea on the valve state. I want a little more bass. And again, a little less treble. And now we're back in the 90s. Let me just switch to my Marshall cab, which sounds a little more hollow. Maybe that helps. That always sounds a little like Morbid Angel. Don't know if they ever used the amp, but that with a Marshall cab, it sounds even more 90s. But this is not the most beautiful tone. It's a very scooped tone. It has that very, very aggressive treble, which sounds a little annoying. It has that cheap sounding distortion, but for anything that's supposed to sound brutal, this is very cool. And it's also cool to be blended with other guitar tones, especially if you have a mid-forward sounding guitar tone. Can be an HM2 guitar tone or just a normal tube amp. And I want to show you this now. So I'm going to reamp 4 tracks, 2 tracks with this setup with a scooped 90s valve state tone, and the other one with a more normal mid-forward sounding tube sound. And I will show you the modern and good sounding tube sound first, and then I will mix in the valve state and you can see what you can do with a sound like this. Enjoy. And this makes the Valvestate a very versatile amp. Yes, the distortion is not the most complex and most sophisticated sounding one, but the filters make it really, really usable and tweakable in the studio. So I've used it in the past for giving other tracks just, you know, the extra mojo, the extra grind, or the extra vintage 90s feel or something. Very interesting amp. And it's the perfect amp to be blended with your typical heavy metal tube amp. People always ask me, how do you blend guitar tones? And I usually tell them, you try to get one guitar tone that sounds as great as possible, and then you analyze what's still missing, and then you try to find another amp or another setup that will give you whatever is missing, the highs, the lows, the mids, whatever. And an amp like this, which sounds very different to most tube amps and that is highly tweakable, comes very, very handy for a job like this. Even if you just mix it in just a little bit, it will bring your main guitar tone just a little closer to perfection. Like I said, every amp should have that contour function. It's really useful. These amps are really cheap, so if you have a studio, if you are crafting guitar tones all the time, this is, try to get a used Valvestate. And I know there will be a lot of comments about the different versions because this is the VS100. I used to have, what is it called, an 8100. And yes, they sound a little different, but for what I'm showing in this video, I think they don't make a real difference. Later, what were they called? The AVT Valvestate series or something? They sounded weird. But both the VS100 and the one before, the 8100, they both sound great, if you ask me. So I wouldn't mind like using any of them. And I think a lot of the older ones have problems, you know, they break very often and you know, so with this one you probably have a little less maintenance issues. All right, let me sum it up one more time. This is a great studio amp for adding like that extra unique mojo. It's a great amp for diving back into the 90s and getting some old school tones. And it's not really bad for beautiful, sophisticated metal tones, but most like full tube amps can do this a lot better. Yeah, that was, I guess, the naked truth about the Valve State. I still love that amp. You know, it's a part of my heavy metal childhood. There's one more really cool thing I forgot to say. If you guys want to get your hands on a Valve State today, there's an easy way to do that. There's one plugin that I can recommend from, once again, from Audiority. I forgot what it's called, but doesn't matter. It's a digital Valve State, the 8100 version that everybody loves. So if you want to play around with that distortion, and if you want to add some old school tones to your existing guitar tone, you might want to check out that Audiority plugin. There's a link below to the plugin. Get it! That's all for today, everybody. I will be back with more very interesting videos about guitar stuff. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel and to ring the bell. And don't forget to subscribe to my email list below. We will have a meeting here in Germany very soon. And there's already like a lot of people coming. We will have a lot of fun in the middle of the German forest. Drink beer and talk about nerdy stuff. So if you want to join us, subscribe to the email list and you will get all the information and like a lot of other cool information. Anyway, here are my socials in case you want to know more about my productions and my products. There's a few other links below, so just check out the description if you like the video. There are links to all the gear used and links to the products that I've released. Thanks a lot for watching this. Don't forget to tell your grandma about this channel. I see you in hell, motherfuckers. Bye-bye.